The coat was navy cashmere and still warm from whoever had just handed it to the cloakroom. My uncle took it off the attendant's arm, folded it over both of mine in front of 200 people, and patted it flat like he was loading a truck.
"Coat checks back through the kitchen," he said. "He knows the way. He used to wash the trucks out there when he was a boy."
The band had gone quiet between songs, so the whole ballroom heard it, and the whole ballroom laughed. "My name is Danny Vaughn." The man laughing was Roland, and he had spent the evening under a banner that read, "Next Chapter," telling anyone with a glass in their hand that he was taking Vaughn Freight into the future. He had pried my grandfather's nameplate off the office door that spring and screwed his own into the empty holes. He had told the family I was staff. What Roland forgot, standing up there in my grandfather's company, is that a register is not a toast. It is a page. My grandfather wrote on that page the morning the doors opened 41 years ago, and he wrote my father's name before anyone else's, and later, in the same careful hand, he wrote mine beneath it. He never wrote Roland's at all. The page still says whose company this is. It also says the signature on Roland's transfer, the one paper his whole claim sits on, was put down in a hand that was not my grandfather's, on a date my grandfather had already been 3 weeks in the ground. I did not carry the coat to the kitchen. I laid it over the chair at the head of the table where the founder used to sit, and I turned around and asked Roland, in front of all of them, what date he thought that paper was signed. He smiled at me like I'd told a joke he'd heard before. He should have answered the question. My grandfather was Walter Vaughn, and the men who bought hauling from him called him Walt. He opened Vaughn Freight 41 years ago with one leased tractor, a gravel yard behind the rail spur, and my father standing next to him in the cold. My father was Tom, Walt's only son, and he came in as a founding partner the morning the doors opened. That was a phrase my grandfather used for the rest of his life, the way other men say the day I got married. The morning the doors opened. He wrote it all down in a cloth-bound book he had bought for the purpose. Who owned what, who answered for what. He put my father's name high on the first page. Mine went on later, the year I turned 9, when he opened a trust in my name and wrote it onto that page beneath Tom's in his own hand. I was a boy of 9, and I held a piece of a freight company before I understood what it was. My father did not get old. I was 7 the year we buried him, and I will not walk you across that ground except to say the company had 2 founding partners in the morning and 1 by the time I started school. After that, my grandfather did a thing most men his age would not do. He did not hand me off to be raised at arm's length and mailed a card on my birthday. He brought me to the yard. I grew up between a dispatch window and a wash bay. A floor man named Cy taught me to coil an air line so it wouldn't kink and to hose the road salt out of a wheel well before it ate the steel. I liked it because Roland would one day make it sound like a sentence a judge had handed down. Nobody made me. I was a boy who wanted to be where his grandfather was, and his grandfather was there. There was a nameplate on the office door. Brass. Walter Vaughn. Founder. On the quiet Saturdays, my grandfather would take a rag and a tin of polish off the shelf and hand them to me and stand behind me with his coffee while I worked and tell me I'd missed a corner. I never had. It was the one job in that building that was only mine, and we both knew he could have done it himself in 10 seconds, and neither of us ever said so. He walked me through the cloth-bound book more than once, the way another man might walk a boy through a photo album. He would open it flat on the desk and lay his finger on the top of the first page.
"There's your dad," he'd say. "There's you. You were on the first page, Danny, before any of them. That's not a favor. That's a fact."
"What's the difference?" I asked him once. I couldn't have been more than 10.
"A favor is the kind of thing Roland does when he wants you grateful," he said. "He can take it back the next morning if it suits him. This isn't that." He pressed his finger flat on the page. "Nobody voted you onto this line, and nobody gets to vote you off it. You were 9 years old, and you were already here, ahead of every one of them. That's a different thing than being liked, Danny. Don't ever let one of them stand in front of you and tell you it's the same thing."
I thought he was showing me a keepsake. I understand now he was handing me the deed to my own life and teaching me 10 years early how to keep a man from talking me out of it.
Most of them read the first line and skip to the part that says money, he told me, tapping the page. You read to the end. I've watched you do it with everything since you were small. That's rarer than you think. Keep doing it.
Once I put my finger further back in the book, on a page crowded with the names of people who worked there, and I asked him where Uncle Roland was. I liked Roland then. He brought me candy and let me sit in the cab of his car.
Roland's back there somewhere, he said, and he did not turn to look for him. Roland draws a paycheck, a good one, but a paycheck and a name on the first page are two different animals, Danny, and don't you ever let a man breed them together in front of you. A fellow who's paid can be told to go home. A fellow on the first page is home. Those two don't cross.
Which one am I? I asked.
You already know, he said. You're just checking that I do.
The last winter he was alive, his hands had started to fail him. I am not going to make theater out of an old man's health. It is enough to say that some mornings the coffee got to the desk, and some mornings it didn't, and he had begun putting things in order the way careful men do near the end. One evening he came out to the yard where I was locking up, carrying a heavy accordion folder against his chest with both arms, the original incorporation file, the first stock ledger, the real ones, the paper the state had stamped the morning the doors opened. He pushed it into my hands like it weighed nothing, which it did not, and like it weighed everything, which it did.
You keep this, he said, not the office you, in your own house where you sleep.
Why me? I said. I don't run anything, Grandpa. I check loads. I fill in on dispatch. Give it to the lawyers.
The lawyers work for whoever's paying them that week, he said. You keep it, and you don't hand it to anybody who comes to your door telling you it belongs to the company.
It's a company file. It does belong to the company.
No. He said it flat, and his old grip came down on my forearm, sudden and certain. It doesn't belong to the company. It says who the company those two things, and one day it's going to matter more than anything I ever taught you about a truck. When that day comes, you read it to the end, and you don't let the calmest man in the room tell you what it says. You read it yourself.
You're talking like something's coming.
Something's always coming, he said. I'd just rather you had it in your hands than theirs when it does.
He died in the spring. It was quiet, and it was the way he wanted, and I sat with him at the end the way I'd sat beside him on all those Saturdays. Then I drove home and did my coming apart there, alone, with the folder on the kitchen table where I could see it. I was not going to do it at the yard, in front of men who needed him to have been made of iron. We buried him on a bright, cold morning with half the county there, men who had hauled for him and men who had hauled against him, standing in the same wet grass. Roland gave the eulogy. He had appointed himself to it without anyone quite deciding he should, and he was good at it because he was always good in front of a crowd. He spoke for a while about the man, and then, so smoothly you could miss the exact place the road turned, he stopped speaking about the man and started speaking about the future.
Walt built something that outlives him, he said, one hand resting on the casket like it was a podium. And the best way any of us can honor him is to carry it forward, not to let it stand still out of grief. He would have hated that. He'd want us moving. He'd want strong hands on the wheel.
Strong hands on the wheel. His were the only hands he named. I stood where a grandson stands and watched my uncle turn a funeral into the opening remarks of a campaign, and I noticed that not one sentence of it mentioned my father, the only son, the other name high on the first page. By the time the dirt was going in, a good part of that crowd had already begun to think of Roland as the man in charge, for no reason except that he was the one who had stood up and sounded like it. That is a real kind of power, the kind that costs nothing and works on almost everyone. I have never had it. What I had was a folder in a house, and an old man's voice telling me it said who the company belonged to. 9 days after we put him in the ground, my phone rang, and it was Roland, and he was warm as a stove.
Danny, how you holding up, son? I've been worried about you. You disappeared after the service.
I'm all right, I said.
Good, good. Listen, I hate to bring business into a hard week, but it's better handled early than late. The estate people are inventorying your grandfather's records, and there's an old file that was supposed to be with the corporate books. Original incorporation paperwork, the first ledger, that kind of thing. Somebody said Walt might have had it out of the office. You wouldn't know where it got to, would you?
There it was, 9 days in, delivered in a voice you could have poured on pancakes. He had not called to see how I was holding up. He had called for the folder, and he had opened with my grief because that was the polite door in. He gave it to me, I said. There was a small pause, the length of a man recalculating.
He gave it to you, the warmth thinned by exactly 1 degree. That's sweet, but it's a corporate record, Danny. It's not a keepsake. It needs to come in with everything else. I'll send somebody by to pick it up. Save you the trip, easy.
He told me to keep it in my house, where I sleep, and not to hand it to anybody who came to the door saying it belonged to the company, I said. You're the second call this week, so no, but thank you for worrying about me. And I hung up, and I moved that folder from the kitchen table to a place in my house that is mine and nobody else's, and I did not tell one member of my family where. I want you to notice that this was before I knew what was in it that mattered. I kept it because my grandfather told me to. That turned out to be the only reason I ever needed. Now I have to tell you about Roland, and I'll try to do it fairly because a man is easier to beat if you see him clearly. Roland was my uncle. He was 58 that spring, and he had been around the company about 30 years, which was most of my life and not much of the company's. He'd run a division, drawn a good salary, worn good suits to the funerals of men who built the thing he collected a check from. He had a way of standing in a doorway with his hands in his pockets that made you feel you were the one visiting. He was not stupid. Stupid men shout. Roland never once raised his voice at me in his life. He'd learned somewhere that the calmest man in the room gets believed, and he had spent decades being the calmest man in the room. 11 days after the funeral, I drove out to the yard, and the nameplate was gone. 4 raw screw holes where it had been, the wood scuffed pale around them, and a new plate seated over them, still bright, that read Roland Vaughn. He was behind my grandfather's desk, in my grandfather's chair, working through the drawers with the patience of a man who has decided the argument is already over. He looked up when my shadow crossed the floor and smiled like I'd come to fix the copier.
Danny, good, I wanted to catch you before things get busy. Sit down.
I did not sit down.
Suit yourself. He leaned back. The chair had been built around a bigger man, and it swallowed him. I'll say it plain, because plain is a kindness. This company is mine. It's been mine in every way that counts for a long time. I ran it while your grandfather got old. I carried it. I kept the lights on when he couldn't tell a Tuesday from a Thursday. Your father's line cashed out of this business years ago.
Cashed out, I said. To who? For how much? When?
It's in the records.
I've read a lot of the records in this building. I've never seen that paper.
Then you haven't read the right ones, he said, unhurried, still smiling. Look, son, I know Walt was sentimental about you. He liked having you around the yard, and there's no shame in it. But sentiment isn't ownership. You've got a good spot here. You're on the payroll. You'll always have a place. Don't take a grandfather's soft heart and turn it into a claim. That road only ends with you looking bitter at a lot of dinners.
He said it kindly. That was the thing about Roland. He could gut you in a tone you'd use to talk a kid down off a roof. I had learned something standing behind that same desk chair as a boy, watching my grandfather deal with men who wanted things. You don't lay your hand out across a desk for a man who's already decided your furniture. I looked around the office while he talked. My grandfather's things were already gone from it. The wall where the first dollar the company ever earned had hung in a frame for 40 years was bare, one clean, pale rectangle in the sun-faded paint. The shelf by the door was empty. Even the hard wooden chair Walt kept for the visitors he didn't like had been carried out. It takes most families weeks of grief to clear a dead man's office. It had taken Roland 11 days, and he had done the door first.
I'm not your enemy, Danny, he said, watching me look. I want you to hear that from me. There's a real place for you here if you'll take it. Fleet, maintenance, something with your hands, something you're actually good at. Your own crew. A title that means something. That's courageous here, son. That's more than a lot of men your age ever get their hands on. All I need from you in return is that you stop treating my office like a crime scene.
Your office, I said.
My office.
You couldn't leave his name on that door 11 days.
A door is a door, he said. It's sentiment, Danny. We already talked about sentiment. A company can't run on it. It runs on somebody being willing to decide things while everyone else is still crying.
Is that what you were doing at his desk when I walked in? I said. Deciding things? Because from the door it looked a lot like going through the drawers.
Somebody has to, he said, and he did not stop doing it. You'll understand when you've run something bigger than a wash bay and a dispatch board. I say that with love, son. I do.
Who bought my father out, Roland? I said again. Give me a name and a year, that's all. One name, 1 year, and I'll walk out of here and never say the word ownership to you again. Something moved behind his eyes, and then it was smoothed away, and he spread his hands like I'd asked him the time.
Diane can walk you through the corporate history whenever you like, he said. She's got the whole file. Honestly, though, I'd hate to watch you spend your grief this way. A grown man digging through a dead one's papers, hunting for a corner he thinks he's owed. It's a sad way to say goodbye to somebody, Danny. He deserves better from you than a lawsuit.
One name, I said. 1 year. You can't give me either one.
I don't owe the yard an accounting of the cap table, he said, and for the first time all morning the warmth went out of his voice entirely. 1 clean second of the real thing before he folded it back up and put it away. Take the job or don't. But stop pulling threads, Danny. You pull enough threads out of a sweater, there's a cold man standing there when you're done, and I would hate for it to turn out to be you.
It was the closest to honest Roland ever came with me. Stop pulling threads. He did not say it because he was strong. He said it because there was a thread, and he knew exactly where it hung, and he had already spent 11 days trying to reach it before I thought to. I noticed he already had a name ready for who would walk me through it. I noticed he was certain I would find nothing. I noticed, most of all, that a man sure of his own ownership does not spend the 11th day after a funeral prying a dead man's nameplate off a door. You do that when the name on the door is the argument, and you want the argument gone before anybody thinks to make it out loud. There was a reason for his hurry, and I only learned the shape of it over that summer in pieces, from men on the floor who talked to me because I'd coiled hose beside them and not because they thought I mattered. Roland had money trouble that had nothing to do with freight. He had put himself into a run of outside ventures, a development that stalled, a partnership that soured, the kind of thing that eats a man who needs to look like he's winning, and they had gone underwater. To keep them breathing, he had been leaning on the one solid thing that had his access on it, the company. He'd borrowed against it. There were people he owed who did not send warm men to make warm calls. The men on the floor didn't know figures, but they knew he had quietly put 2 of the terminals up as security over the winter, and that a hauling contract we had held for a decade had been signed away cheap to a shipper nobody at the yard had ever heard of, and that a man in an expensive coat had come to the office twice and left angry both times. You don't need schooling to add that up. You need to have grown up somewhere and know what fear looks like on a confident man. And that banner he would one day raise, next chapter, the sale he was lining up to a buyer out of state. That was not a visionary carrying the business into the future. That was a man with water at his chin reaching for the biggest thing in the room to keep his head above it, and the biggest thing in the room happened not to be his to sell. I didn't have the proof of it yet. I had the smell of it. A man doesn't move that fast on a nameplate for the future. He moves that fast on a clock. The family closed around him the way families do, toward the loudest confidence and the nicest suit. Within a month, he had them half believing that keeping me close was a generosity he performed out of respect for Walt. There was a dinner. There is always a dinner. My aunt's long table, full of people who had cried at the funeral, and Roland ran it like a man chairing a board. He waited until the plates were cleared, and then he turned the whole warm weight of the room on me.
Danny, I want to say something, and I want to say it in the open, because you deserve to hear it in front of the people who love you. He put on the sad, generous voice. After everything Walt did for you, taking you in when you had nobody, keeping your family close, giving you a place a lot of men would have let you drift right past, it would break my heart to see you do something that embarrassed this family and dragged the company he built through a courtroom. There's talk you've been going through his private papers. Nobody blames a grieving man for being emotional. But there's a right way to grieve and a wrong way, and the wrong way ends with all of us in front of a judge over a man who isn't even cold. And your father, God rest Tom, was a gentleman. He'd be heartbroken to watch his only boy turn his grief into a grudge. He would not have wanted this for you, and somewhere under all this you know it.
Heads moved around the table, not cruel heads, tired ones. People who wanted the grief to be finished and had decided I was the thing keeping the wound open. My cousin Paige was there, Roland's daughter, 30 and sharp and dressed like the future he kept promising everyone. He'd been grooming her out loud for a year. The next generation, he called her, seating her at his right hand. She slid a folder across the table to me between the coffee cups, cool and correct. A young woman doing her father's filing.
It's a consulting agreement, she said. A retainer, a title, a number that's honestly more than fair. You keep your connection to the company, you keep your dignity, everybody moves on. Dad had Diane draw it up clean.
And the release stapled to the back of it? I said, because I could see the second document through the first.
Standard, she said, not blinking. It just says you won't contest the estate. Read it, sign it, and none of this has to turn ugly, Danny. That's what it's for. So it doesn't turn ugly.
A number that's more than fair. A title. A retainer. And all I had to do to receive it was put my name on a page promising I would never look too closely at any other page. I understood the shape of it exactly. They were not paying me to consult. They were buying my silence, and the price they'd set for my silence was my own signature swearing I'd stop reading. I picked the folder up. I read the number, which was, I'll be honest, more than I had ever been offered for anything in my life. Then I set it down and slid it, gently, back across the table to Paige. Tell your father I don't need to be paid to keep quiet about something that isn't true, I said, and tell him I read to the end. Grandpa liked that about me. It's about the only thing I've got that he can't put a number on.
He's trying to help you, Paige said, and for 1 second it did not come out like a line she had been handed to read. You could let him. It would be so much easier than whatever it is you think you're going to do instead.
Easier for who? I said. She didn't answer that. She squared the folder against the edge of the table, lining its corners up, like the whole conversation was a document she could make neat if she just got it straight enough.
Danny, Roland said softly to his coffee, not to me. You're making this so much harder than it needs to be.
You keep saying that, I said, and I stood up. It isn't hard at all. You just don't like the easy version. Paige didn't move a muscle. But an ant down the table looked at me the way you look at a man who has chosen the hard bed on purpose, and I watched the room decide, in that second, which of the two of us was the problem. I did not sign. I drove home to a house with an accordion folder in it, and I understood that turning them down had cost me the last of their patience. It cost me more than patience. Roland was far too careful to fight me where I could see him do it. He fought me in rooms I wasn't in. Over the next weeks, it got back to me the way these things always get back to you, in the careful faces of men who used to grip my hand and now kept their sentences short. I heard the exact shape of what he was saying to the board, because a man who'd sat in on it repeated it to me in a parking lot with his eyes on his shoes, half as a warning and half as an apology.
I love that kid, I do, so this is hard for me to say, Roland had told them in that same reasonable voice. But Danny isn't well. You all knew Walt let him sweep floors around the yard as a boy. Charity, really, and somewhere in his head that turned into the idea that he's an owner. He's been in the old man's private papers, taking things. I'm worried about him, honestly, and I'm worried about our exposure because a man in that state will say anything to anyone, and we've got a sale to protect. We just need to be careful. Legally careful. That's all I'm asking.
It was clean work, and I could admire it even while it buried me. He never called me a liar. He called me sad. He never said I was dangerous. He said he was worried. And it landed, Because it is always easier to believe the calm man in the good suit than the wiry nephew. Nobody ever thought ran a thing in his life. Men who had known me since I was small started looking at the ground when I said hello. A dispatcher I'd covered 100 shifts for went quiet when I walked the floor. Roland never once had to push me out of anything. He only had to get everyone to agree I had walked out on my own. It went brick by brick, and every brick arrived polite. A cousin I had grown up next to stopped returning my calls. The family's old accountant, a man who used to bounce me on his knee at Christmas, sent word through my aunt that it would not be appropriate for him to discuss company matters with me. I was quietly left off the list for a christening. None of it came dressed as cruelty. That was the craft of the thing. Every single person believed they were being reasonable, protecting a grieving family from an unstable young man, and every reasonable person set one more brick, and none of them ever saw the wall they were building because each of them only ever laid the one. I called Roland once about it, to give him the chance to be a man about it into a phone, at least if he couldn't manage it to my face. "You told the board I'm unstable," I said when he picked up. "You told them I've been stealing from a dead man's desk."
I told them I was worried about you, he said, unbothered, like I'd called to confirm a lunch. And I am, Danny, listen to yourself. Calling me at night, keeping a tally of the things I say in private rooms. That is not a well man talking. I say it because I care about you.
You care?
I do, which is why the offer is still open, and it will not be open forever. Sign the paper, take the title. Let me give you a good life inside this company instead of a bitter one outside of it. Your grandfather would want you looked after.
My grandfather would have wanted a lot of things, I said. Being looked after by you was never going to be one of them.
Then I can't help you, he said, and he sounded almost sad, and I think a small true part of him was. I really can't. Remember that I tried.
He hung up first. He always liked to hang up first. It let him feel like the man who ended things. I sat in the dark with the phone still warm against my ear and understood that we were past the part where words were going to fix anything between us. That was fine. I had never once planned to win this with words. That was the bottom, not the coat. The coat came later, and by the time it came, I was ready for it. The bottom did not arrive all at once. It arrived over 3 years. The slow work of standing in a yard I had grown up in and feeling it decide, season after season, that I was a stranger with a grudge. By the time I reached the floor of it, my grandfather had been 3 years in the ground, and the whole world he built had agreed, gently and without malice, that I had never belonged in it. I did not drive to the state on a hunch. I drove because of what I had done at my own kitchen table in the worst of it. I took the accordion folder out of its place, and I read the founding register the way my grandfather taught me. My father's name high on the first page. My name under it, in Walt's careful hand, a boy of 9 made an owner. And nowhere, in 41 years of entries, on any page, the name Roland. Not as owner, not as partner. Whatever Roland drew from that company, it lived in a different book entirely, exactly where my grandfather had pointed his finger the day I was 10. Which meant, your father's line cashed out was not a fact. It was a piece of paper. Roland was too careful a man to say a thing like that with nothing at all under it, so somewhere there had to be a document he was standing on that I had never once seen, with a signature on it making it real. I did not have to be clever about that. I had to be stubborn. I needed the state's own certified copy of the truth, so that when Roland's paper finally came out into the light, it would have something solid to stand beside. And I needed my grandfather's genuine signature. The real one the state had kept on file since the morning the doors opened. Because I did not intend to be shown a signature ever that I couldn't lay against the truth in daylight. A grieving man does one of 2 things at the bottom. He argues with the people who have stopped listening, or he stops talking to them entirely and goes and gets the one thing that does not care how sad he looks. I stopped talking. Roland had built his whole calm empire on the certainty that the paper was settled, that nobody would ever go and pull it and read it all the way down. So one Monday I got in my truck before the yard opened, and I drove 4 hours to the state capitol, to the corporate division on the 3rd floor of a gray building, and I stood at a counter under bad light and asked a clerk for the one thing my uncle was certain no living person would ever ask for. I asked for a certified copy of the founding register of Vaughn Freight, as recorded the morning the doors opened 41 years ago. And then, because my grandfather had spent my whole childhood teaching me that the end of any signed thing is the signature, I asked for the genuine signature card the state had kept on file for Walter Vaughn since the day he incorporated. The clerk did not know my family. She did not know I'd been called unstable in rooms across the state. She knew a records request and a fee. She went into the back, and she was gone long enough that I read every notice stapled to the wall twice, and then some. I want to be honest about how ordinary all of it was. There was no clever plan and no lucky break. There was a gray building, a laminated number ticket, a bench with one short leg, and a fee I paid in cash because I did not want a card with my name on it to be the record of my having come. I sat under a clock that ran 2 minutes behind, and I did the one thing my grandfather had trusted me to do above everything else, which was wait and read and refused to talk myself out of a fact just because a whole room full of tired people had agreed it wasn't one. Then she came back, and she slid the certified copy across the counter, and it settled under my hand with the small, dry weight of a thing that had been true for 41 years while everyone who knew it agreed not to look. Roland had built his whole claim on a page he had never once read to the end. I had read it as a boy, in the founder's chair, with the man who wrote it, and now the state had stamped its seal over the same words and set them in my hand, and my uncle, 400 miles away under his fall banner, planning the party where he would give my grandfather's company away, had no idea I was already holding the morning the doors opened. Diane Reyes worked out of a second-floor office across the square from the courthouse, above a print shop that ran its presses until noon, so the boards under her chairs buzzed while I sat there and waited for her to finish reading. She was 51, gray, coming in at the temples, and she had told me on the phone that she did not take cases she thought she would lose, and did not pretend the ones she took were simple. 3 firms had already turned me away before her. 2 of them used the same words, that the founder's grandson should let the estate run its course, which is a courteous way of telling a man to hold still while he is being emptied out. The third had a partner who golfed with Roland, and I found that out from the receptionist, not the partner. So I had come to Diane with low expectations and a manila envelope, and she had spent the first 10 minutes of our appointment not looking at me at all. She did not shake my hand and start talking. She held out her palm for the envelope.
"You told me on the phone you had the recorded incorporation," she said. "Not a family keepsake. The one the state actually holds."
I slid it across. She broke the flap with a thumbnail and drew out the certified copy. The corporate division's stamp bled blue through the back of the top sheet, and she read it the way my grandfather used to read a bill of lading. Top to bottom, thumb tracking down the margin, no page turned before the last line of the one under it. The presses hummed under the floor. A truck downshifted somewhere out on the square, and the sound came up through the building the way every sound in that town eventually came back to freight. She read for a long time and said nothing, and I let her, because I had read the same page myself once, at 9 years old, standing on a stool that put me level with the founder's desk, while a broad hand rested flat on the paper beside my own, and told me which lines were the family and which were the payroll.
"This is the founding register," she said at last. "The first stock ledger recorded the day the company incorporated 41 years ago." She turned the top sheet toward me and set a finger under the first block of writing. "Whose hand is this?"
"My grandfather's," I said. "Walter. He wrote the whole first page himself, the morning the doors opened. He didn't trust anyone else to do it. He used to say a man should write down what's his in his own hand, or not be surprised when it goes missing."
"He wrote your father in first," she said, and she was not asking any more. "Thomas Vaughan. Founding partner, majority line, and under him held in trust until you came of age, that's you. A miner's trust line your grandfather added years after the doors opened, when you were still a boy." She looked up over the page. "You were a child when this line went on."
"I was 9, I said. "He walked me down the ledger with his finger exactly like you're doing. He put my name above men who'd loaded trucks for him for 20 years, and I didn't understand what it meant. I thought it was a game he had for me, something he did on slow afternoons. I didn't understand it was a promise until there was no one left alive who'd honor it. She kept reading down the page. I watched her get to the name I had come there to make her find. Her finger stopped, went back up 2 lines, came down again, and something changed in her jaw. Small, the way a person's face changes when a story they've been told falls out of line with a document in their hands.
But Roland's here, he tells people he is. He's a salaried entry, a minority stake tied to his employment, granted years after this was opened, and small. He's on this page the way a shift foreman is on this page. She sat back in her chair. He is not a founding owner, Danny. He never was. On the document the state itself keeps, in its own vault, he is staff with a little equity attached to keep him loyal.
There is a particular quiet that arrives when a stranger says out loud a thing you have carried by yourself so long you had stopped believing anyone would ever say it. I did not answer her. I looked at the buzzing floor, and I thought about the man who had stood me up in front of 200 people and named me the hired help of my own family, and I understood that on the only page that had ever counted, the small word he loved to pin on me had always belonged to him. A name added late, near the bottom, kept on because the old man had uses for him.
You need to understand something before we take one more step, she said. Because most people who come through that door believe the opposite, and it costs them everything. She squared the pages against the desk. You didn't inherit a claim, Danny. You lost. The page never stopped saying your name. Whatever Roland has been doing for 30 years, he's been doing it on top of a document that has said, the entire time, in ink older than you are, that this company runs to your father's line and to you.
Then why? I said. Does he get to sit in the chair?
Because nobody ever made him stand up, she said. He sat down in the seat. He called it his. Loud for long enough, and the people around him found it easier to agree than to fight him over it. None of that is ownership. None of it is written down anywhere. It only feels permanent because it went unchallenged. She tapped the register once with 2 fingers. This is different. This is on file with the state. This they can't outshout.
I had come in, braced to convince her. I'd had a speech ready in the car, the way you rehearse a thing you are afraid of, all about the old man and the ledger and the afternoon promise, because I expected her to look at me the way the rest of them had learned to look at me, the bitter one, the grudge holder, the grown man who thought a company was owed to him because the founder had once let him near it. I did not get to give the speech. She had read the page, and the page had said it for me. In a hand 4 decades cold, and I felt the whole structure of the thing shift underneath me, the way you feel a heavy load finally settle when the truck takes the grade and stops fighting the hill. So I have a claim, I said, to a piece of it. My father's line, my trust line. I can force them to recognize it.
You could, she said. And the way she said it told me she was about to tell me not to. And it would be the smallest thing you could possibly do with what's in your closet and the weakest. Sit with me a minute, because the mistake is going to feel like the strong move, and it's the exact one that loses.
She came around the desk and sat on the front edge of it, close, the register in her lap, and she talked to me then, the way you talk to somebody you've decided to actually pull out of the water rather than merely narrate the drowning.
If you walk in demanding your share, you've accepted his whole story, she said, and you own a slice, and now you're just haggling over the size of it. You'd spend 2 years and everything you've saved to come out a minority partner to the man who did that to you in front of the whole room. Every dividend he ever drew, he keeps. Every dollar he paid himself to sit in that chair, he keeps. The sale closes. You a check for your fraction, thanks you for being reasonable, and that's the shape of the rest of your life. She let it sit between us. That's the move that feels strong. Now here's what's actually true, and it's better than you let yourself hope for on the drive over.
Tell me.
Everything he has that makes him more than a salaried minority. The control, the right to sell the company at all, Every bit of it rests on one piece of paper. She held up a single finger between us. 1. A share transfer deed. He has 3 years of behaving like the owner, but underneath the behavior there is exactly one document that ever moved the majority off your grandfather and onto him. It's the hinge the whole door hangs on. And on the phone you told me the date on that hinge is wrong.
It's dated after he died, I said.
Then we don't sue him for a share, she said. We take out the hinge. If that transfer falls, if a court says it never validly happened, he doesn't shrink down to a slightly smaller owner. He drops all the way back to what this page already calls him. A minority employee who has spent 3 years running and drawing from and now trying to sell a company that was never his to touch. She held my eyes. In plain English, pull that one deed and he never owned a bolt of it.
And the money he took out of it, all those years.
Comes back, she said. Not into your pocket. That's a separate fight, and a cleaner one than you'd think. But every dividend he drew as a majority owner he wasn't. Every dollar he paid himself as an officer he had no standing to be, a court can order disgorged. Handed back. You don't recover a slice, Danny. You unwind 3 years of a man being paid to be somebody he wasn't. She stood up off the desk. And the sale? This next chapter, he's built a Gala round. He can't sell a company he doesn't own. If the transfer is void, there's nothing under the sale at all. It isn't a hard deal or a bad deal. It's a banner and a party with no goods behind it.
I want to be exact about what I felt because it wasn't joy and it wasn't relief. It was the narrow, cold satisfaction of a thing finally being the right size. For 3 years I had measured all of this in the words they'd handed me. A grievance, a grudge, a slice I might, if I behaved, be judged big enough to be granted. In 20 minutes, she had swept every one of those words off the table and set down in their place a thing with the true proportions of what had been done. He had not shorted me a portion. He had taken the entire company, balanced the whole weight of it on one forged page, and had spent years making sure I thought of myself as too small to matter, so I'd never think myself worth enough to read the page closely. The smallness had been the strategy, not the insult. Keep a man certain he is nothing, and he never once thinks to check the line that says otherwise.
There are 3 doors, not one, she said, and she counted them off on her fingers with drama at all, which was how I knew she had walked through them before. The corporate division at the Secretary of State, where the register lives. They can restore you as controlling owner of record, because the record already says you are. Somebody just stopped enforcing it. Civil court, where we ask a judge to void the transfer and freeze whatever it produced before it can move. And if the signature is what you tell me it is, a 3rd door I'd rather not open. The district attorney's forgery unit. Signing a dead man's name onto a legal instrument isn't a family disagreement. It has its own drawer.
And I do what? I said. In all of that.
Less than you'll want to, she said. You hold the original, and you keep it somewhere I can't be surprised out of it. You've already done the 2 things that matter. You kept the file when his people came to take it, and you pulled the certified copy yourself. So we're not standing in a courtroom asking anyone to trust your family's word about a family Bible. We're pointing at the state's own vault. After that I file, an examiner examines. A clerk certifies. Your job is to not lose the paper and to not tip him before we're standing where I want to be standing. She looked at me a beat longer than the sentence needed. Can you manage the second one? Because from everything you've told me about this man, he is going to come to you sweet, and soon, and he is going to ask you for the one thing you cannot give him.
She was right on both counts, and it took Roland 9 days. He didn't call first. He sent Paige to soften the ground, his daughter, 30, the one they had been grooming for years to stand at his shoulder and smile at the right people at the right moments. She came by on a Thursday with a foil pan of the food her mother made and a lot of careful talk about how everyone was tired, how her father wasn't as hard as he seemed, how it would mean so much to him if I came to the gala and we all just moved forward. I took the pan and thanked her and said very little, and I watched her leave and thought that whatever they'd promised her, she was reciting it like a girl who'd been handed lines and hadn't yet read the last page of the script. Then, 2 days after that, Roland called himself and asked me to lunch, as if the last 3 years had been a small misunderstanding between two busy men. We met at the Old Chophouse, 2 blocks off the freight yard, the place where my grandfather used to take the whole floor crew every Christmas, which was a thing Roland chose on purpose, the way he chose everything on purpose. He was already at the table when I came in. He stood, put out his hand, and gripped my shoulder with the other one, warm, holding the pose a half-second too long for a room that mostly knew our name.
"Danny," he said, "you look good. You look like your father." He sat. "I've been meaning to do this a long time, and I let the company keep me from it, and that's on me. A man gets busy and forgets what actually matters." He shook out his napkin. "Let me say the thing I came to say before the food gets here and I talk myself out of it. I've been unfair to you, some of it in front of people. That night with the coat, that was a bad joke that landed a lot worse than I meant it, and I've thought about it more than you'd ever believe."
I had spent 3 years learning to read the flat, pleasant surface of this man, so I sat still and let him build it. Because a man who opens with an apology he doesn't owe is a man about to ask you for something he has no right to take.
"Here's what I want to do," he said. "Gala's in 3 weeks. The next chapter night, I want you there at the family table. Not," he waved a hand, brushing the whole thing away, all of it, as though it had been done by some other man entirely. "Not any of that anymore. I want to stand up in front of everyone and put a title on you, Director Emeritus. Your grandfather's name and your father's name should be on that wall, and they should be on you. There's a stipend that comes with it, a consulting arrangement. It's real money, Danny, and it's clean and it's yours, and it is the least this family owes you after all of it."
Emeritus, I said.
"It's an honor," he said.
It's a title you give a man you've already retired, I said. You'd stand me up in front of 200 people to announce formally that I'm finished. Something moved behind his eyes and was gone, and he smiled the way he smiles, which is with the lower half of his face only, the top half staying home to watch.
"You've gotten sharp," he said. "Good. I like it better than the sulking." He leaned in over the bread. "All right. Straight then. You've been to see a lawyer. I'm not angry. I'd have done exactly the same in your shoes. But you and I both know how these things actually go. You spend your father's memory and every dollar you've got on a fight that drags out for years and salts every relationship you have left. And at the end of it, a judge hands you a number smaller than what I'm putting on this table today, clean this month. I'm trying to save you from the worst decision of your life. And I'm trying to do it kindly, because whatever you think of me, I did love the old man."
What do you want? I said. For the honor and the stipend. Nobody sets a table like this to give money away.
"2 things," he said, easy as if they weighed nothing at all. "You sign a release. Standard, my attorney draws it. All it says is that we're square and you won't drag the company through court, and you bring back Walter's papers." He said that part into his water glass, casual, not looking at me. "The old incorporation file, his things from the office. They belong with the estate, Danny. They never should have gone home with you, and honestly, it isn't right. You sitting on the founder's records in a spare room for 3 years like they're yours to keep. Bring them to the gala. Hand them to me at the family table where people can see you doing the decent thing, and we start clean. That's the whole of it. That's all I'm asking."
And there it was, laid on a white tablecloth between the bread and the water. He had come to lunch to buy my silence, and in the same soft breath, to get his hands on the single object on earth that could finish him. The original file my grandfather had pressed into my arms 2 weeks before he died and told me to keep safe, the register that said in his own hand who this company belonged to. Roland did not want the papers because they belonged with the estate. He wanted them fed into a shredder before the sale closed. He had once folded a coat over my arms to make me small in front of a room, and now he was smiling at me over lunch and asking me, gently, to carry the fire to him myself and thank him for the chance. So I did the only thing worth doing. I let him believe it was working. "It's a lot of paper," I said slowly, like a man being talked patiently around a corner. It's been in a box in my closet for 3 years. If it actually settles things, all of it, I'll bring it to the Gala. I made myself hold his eyes and let a little tiredness into mine, which did not take much acting. I don't want to spend my 40s in a courtroom over a company that never wanted me in it, Roland. I really don't.
There he is, Roland said, and he reached across and closed his hand round my forearm, warm again, delighted, a man who had gotten exactly what he'd sat down to get. That's your father in you, practical. Tom always knew when to take the deal. He lifted 2 fingers for the check. Bring the file. Sign the release. Wear something decent. And Danny, the warmth thinned for just a second, down to the cold thing that lived underneath it. Bring all of it. The whole file. I'll know if a page is missing. I kept those records with your grandfather for 30 years. I know that file better than you ever could.
That last part was a lie, so specific, it was almost a gift. He had not kept those records with anyone for 30 years. He had sat in an office and drawn a check and let other men do the keeping. But it told me plainly that he was afraid of that file, page by page, and he'd tried far too hard to sound like he owned it. I drove to Diane's straight from the Chophouse and told her what he'd asked for, and she didn't look surprised, and she didn't look pleased either. She looked like a person who had just heard a clock start ticking somewhere in the walls.
3 weeks, that's not sentiment. That's a deadline. He isn't asking for the file because it's tidy. He's asking because the sale closes on the far side of that Gala, and once it closes, unwinding it gets 10 times harder. A new owner, new money. A stranger's lawyers standing between you and the truth. He needs the original gone, and your name on a release, before the deal is done. She thought for a moment, tapping a pen against her knuckle. You're going to give him something at that Gala?
I'm not giving him the file, I said.
No. You're going to give him a certified copy in a sealed envelope, and let him carry it around all night like a trophy, she said. The original goes into my safe tonight, and here's the part he will never once consider, because men who think the way he thinks believe a document is a thing you can hold, and therefore a thing you can burn. Something close to a smile touched her mouth and left it. He could set fire to every page in your closet, and it wouldn't move a single line. The register doesn't live in your spare room. It lives in the state's vault, and you cannot pry a public record off a door. He has spent his whole life stealing a name off a wall, and never once noticed the name was also written down somewhere he can't reach.
We put the original into her safe that night, my grandfather's file going in behind a steel door with a sound I felt in my teeth, and I drove home with a certified copy riding on the passenger seat and a decoy fixed in my mind, and for the first time in 3 years I was the one running the clock instead of standing under it, waiting for it to run out on me. But I still had not touched the lie itself. I had the register, and I had the strategy, and I had a man across town who thought he'd just bought me for the price of a lunch. What I did not yet have, flat under a lamp in my own 2 hands, was the forged page. 6 days before the Gala, Diane called and said the recorded transfer had come in from the public file, and the genuine signature card had come with it, and that I should come and look at both of them myself before an examiner ever put a loop to them, because there were things a man who had actually known Walter Vaughn would catch in a second that a stranger might spend a day chasing. I went that evening. She had cleared her desk down to the bare wood and set 3 things on it under the lamp, side by side, in a row, like a hand of cards she was about to make me read. On the left, the certified founding register, my grandfather's page, my father's name, my own. In the middle, the share transfer deed Roland had filed all those years ago, the one paper his whole reign stood on, pulled now from the public record where anyone with the patience could find it. And on the right, a small, stiff rectangle the state had held for 40 years, a signature card, my grandfather's name signed across it 3 times the day he first registered as an officer of the company he'd just built.
Take your time, she said, and she stepped back to the window and left me standing over it alone.
I looked at the signature card first because I couldn't have stopped myself if I'd tried. Walter G. Vaughn. 3 times. In blue ink gone thin with the years. The the same each time, the way a man signs his own name so often it finally comes out of the pen without him being in the room for it. And there was the G. My grandfather signed everything with his middle initial, and the tail of the G always doubled back on itself at the bottom into a small closed loop, like a shell, a thing his hand did on its own and had done since long before I was born. I was maybe 7, the first time he sat me at the kitchen table and made me practice it, his hand heavy over mine.
There, he had said, when I finally got the tail to curl back and close, the G doubles back on itself. Your father makes his the very same way. Now do it again, slower, and don't you lift the pen off the paper till it's done.
I stood in Diane's office nearly 30 years after that kitchen table and looked at the same doubled-back G 3 times on the card, and then I moved my eyes 8 inches to the left onto the signature at the bottom of Roland's transfer, and the G there did not double back. It sat open at the base, a plain little hook that went nowhere, a stranger's honest guess at a dead man's hand. Once you have seen the true one, you cannot stop seeing the false one beside it. It is the difference between a person's face and a photograph somebody took of the face and then traced from memory. But that was the part that belonged to an examiner, and Diane had already told me so I made myself do the other thing. The thing that needed no expert eye at all, the thing any grown man alive could do standing at a desk with 2 papers. I looked at the date. My grandfather died in the spring. We buried him on a gray Saturday morning with the whole floor crew standing in a row along the back of the church in their good jackets, hats in their hands, men who had loaded his trucks for decades and did not know how to be in a church. 3 weeks after that Saturday, to the day, he was still in the ground, and would be in the ground forever after. And the transfer deed lying on Diane's desk, the single page that moved his company off him and onto Roland, the hinge the whole door swung on, was dated 3 weeks and 1 day after we had lowered him into it. I read the date 4 times. I put my finger on it the way Diane had put her finger on the register and the way my grandfather had put his finger on the ledger. 3 men and 3 fingers and 1 line each across the years. A man cannot sign his own name 3 weeks after his own funeral. There is no reading of it that turns it into anything but exactly what it is. Roland had sat down at an empty desk in a dead man's office, taken a clean form out of a drawer, and set a hand that curled the wrong way onto a date its supposed author had already spent 3 weeks being unable to reach. And then I saw the smaller thing, the thing underneath, and it was almost worse for how ordinary it was. The transfer had a cover sheet clipped to it, a routing page meant to make the packet look properly in motion going into the file, and that cover sheet carried an earlier date, backdated, to a week when my grandfather was still alive, so the whole thing would seem to have been underway before he died. But the cover sheet was a different paper, whiter, brighter at the edges, a stock that had plainly not been sitting in a drawer for the years it was claiming to have waited there. He had aged the story and forgotten to age the page it was printed on. Diane watched me work down through the 3 of them in the right order, the date first, then the paper, then back up to the G, and she said nothing until I straightened up off the desk.
You saw the date before I had to point at it, she said. Good. Because that's the one no jury needs an expert for. Any 12 people out of a phone book can hold 2 dates next to each other and count the weeks between them. The examiner is for the hand, and I already sent him clean copies days ago. His finding on the signature comes back on his own letterhead, independent, so no one in a courtroom can stand decided all by himself what his grandfather's writing looked like. She squared the 3 pages back into their row on the wood. What you did just now, standing here, any room full of ordinary people can do it. That's what makes it dangerous to him. This stopped being a family feud the moment you set those 2 dates side by side. This is a page a man wrote in a dead man's name, and the day he chose to pretend the dead man had written it. The dead man had already been 3 weeks in the ground.
I didn't drive straight home. I drove to the freight yard instead, late After the last shift had cleared the lot and the gate stood open the way it always did until midnight, and I stood in the dark against the fence and looked up at the office my grandfather had built the whole company out of. There was a light left burning over the door, the way there had always been a light left burning over that door, and under it, screwed into the wood, the brass that read Roland Vaughn now, where another name had hung for 40 years. He'd torn the old one down the spring the funeral happened. Even from the lot, even in the dark, you could see he had done it in a hurry and never bothered to fix the wound. His own sat a little crooked, not quite covering what had been there before it, and around its edges the wood showed gouged and pale where the screws had been wrenched out fast, 4 small raw holes that nothing would ever cover. He had done to that door precisely what he had done to the page on Diane's desk. He had pulled a name off a thing that was never his to change, driven his own down over the top of it, and left the holes showing for anyone who cared to stand in the dark and look close. The examiner's letter came back 4 days later. It was 1 sentence long on his own letterhead, and it did not use the word forgery, because men in that line of work never do. It said only that the signature on the transfer was not consistent with the known exemplars of Walter G. Vaughn, and that, in the examiner's professional opinion, the two had not been produced by the same hand. I read it twice and laid it in the drawer at Diane's beside the register and the card and the deed, 4 pages now that fit together like a jaw closing, and I finally understood the whole shape of what Roland had asked me for over that lunch. The papers he wanted me to carry to the family table and hand him gently in front of everyone so we could start clean. Those 4 pages were the only objects on earth that could take everything from him at once. He had smiled at me across the bread and asked me to burn them for him. I had handed him a copy to carry around his party and kept the fire in a lawyer's safe, and there was 1 page still left to pull before we filed. One Diane wanted in her hand first, the full founding chain, every filing made on the company in order from the morning the doors opened. Because the register told us Roland had never been a founding owner. It had not yet told us how a man who started as a name near the bottom of somebody else's page had ever gotten close enough to the founder's chair to reach up and tear a name off the door. I did not sit on it overnight. If I slept on a thing like that, I'd only wake up hunting for a reason to slide it back in the drawer, and I had run clean out of reasons. The evening, I laid the transfer beside my grandfather's genuine signature card and read the date on it out loud to an empty kitchen, a date that landed 3 weeks after we'd put him in the ground. I set both under a lamp, photographed every line twice, and put the originals back where no one but me could reach them. Then I copied the photographs to 2 drives, mailed one to myself, and drove the flat envelope with the working copies to Diane Reyes before I could talk myself into being reasonable about it. She already had the register copy. What she did not have yet was the deed with the dead man's date at the bottom of it, and the 1-page finding from the examiner she'd sent it to, a stranger with no stake in my family, that the loop on the tail of the G in Vaughn had been drawn by a hand that was not the hand behind the genuine signatures the state had on file. Reyes read the examiner's page twice. Then she set it flat on the blotter, squared it to the desk edge the way careful people square things, and looked at me across it.
You understand what you're holding.
It wasn't a question, so I didn't answer it like one. I understand he signed my grandfather's name onto a company my grandfather already gave to my father's line before Roland ever set foot on the dock. I want to know what we do with it, and I want to know today.
Then here is today. She pulled a legal pad toward her and started writing before she'd finished the sentence. 2 filings and a phone call. First, an emergency injunction in civil court. I go to a judge and I ask him to freeze the transfer and everything that grew out of it. The accounts, the officer pay, the pending sale, before your uncle can move another $1 or sign anything in a ballroom. Frozen means his hands come off the controls the same day a judge signs, not after a trial.
And a signature nobody can unsign.
A signature in a dead man's hand on a post-dated instrument isn't a civil headache, Danny. It's a crime. So the second thing is a forgery referral to the district attorney's office. I want it on a prosecutor's desk with a date stamp older than his party, so that whatever he stands up and says next, The record already knows he's a forger before he opens his mouth.
I signed the verification page while she was still talking. For 3 years, the family had told a story in which I was a bitter man, rummaging through a dead man's papers looking for something he was owed. Here is what the bitter man actually did. He put his name under an oath in front of a notary that every word of it was true, and he handed a woman with a bar card and a stranger with a badge the authority to check him and jail him if he'd lied. Roland never once put his name under an oath about that deed. He put my grandfather's there instead, and my grandfather had been in the ground 3 weeks when he did it. You said a phone call.
The corporate division. I'm ordering the full certified chain of title. Every recorded owner Von Freight has ever had, from the morning the doors opened to the week your grandfather died. The register you handed me is a page. I want all of them, sealed by the state, so that no lawyer of his can ever stand up and say we showed the judge our favorite sheet and hid the rest.
She filed the injunction petition at 4 that afternoon. The clerk stamped it received while I stood at the counter, and the stamp was a small, dull sound, and I have thought since that it was the first honest paperwork done in that company's name in a very long time. I am not a man who can lay 2 signatures side by side and tell you which hand made which. What I did was read a date, and then find a stranger who does the other thing for a living and pay her to look at the ink without ever knowing whose family it would fall on. She didn't know Roland. She didn't know me. She knew loops and pressure, and the small tells a real hand leaves that a copied one can't. She wrote 1 flat page, and it said the same thing the calendar had already told me at my kitchen table. What made the stamp on that petition sweeter was that Roland believed he had already won this exact fight. Weeks before, over lunch, he had offered me a title with emeritus buried in it and a yearly sum to keep me quiet, on one condition, that I hand my grandfather's file back to the estate, where a page can go quiet and then go missing. I had agreed, and handed him a dulled, creased, certified copy to carry off in both palms, while the original went into the one place only I can reach. For a month he had been sleeping easy, certain the single page that could end him sat harmless in his own drawer. It had been sitting in mine the whole time, and I'd already read it aloud to a notary. I had the deed in my hands that week, and holding it I could finally see the room it had been born in. While the rest of us were still writing thank-you cards for the flowers, Roland had been the first one through the office door, the only one not too polite or too afraid to move a dead man's chair. He took a blank share transfer out of the drawer, wrote my grandfather's name on the line where an owner gives everything away, and his own on the line where a man receives it, and then drew the signature at the bottom slow enough to catch the loops. A forger can copy a hand. He cannot move a date, and a dead man cannot hold a pen. So he clipped an older cover sheet over the top and backdated the whole thing into the spring, betting no one would ever set the real filing date beside the one carved on the headstone and count the 3 weeks between them. For years, no one did. I did it at a kitchen table with 2 pieces of paper, and the 3 weeks did not move an inch. That was the story I thought I would carry into a courtroom. 1 desk, 1 forged sheet. 3 years of a man wearing a crown he'd inked for himself in an empty office. Then Reyes's certified chain came back from the state, and it told me something about Roland I had been looking straight at my entire life and never once weighed. It didn't say he had taken too much. It said he had never been on the page at all. The chain came in a manila envelope thick as a phone book, every recorded owner of Von Freight, from the morning the doors opened 41 years ago to the week my grandfather died, certified page after page under the state's raised seal. Reyes cleared her table and laid it out like she was dealing a long hand of cards, and she walked me down it with the cap of her pen.
Here's the first page. Day 1, 41 years back. 2 names on the founding line, Walter Vaughan and Tom Vaughan. Your grandfather and your father founding partners the morning the doors opened. She moved the pen down a 1/4 inch. Here's your father's line placing you on it. A trust because you were 9 years old. That is the controlling majority, Danny, and it has been the controlling majority for 26 years, through every page in this stack, without a single break.
And Roland.
That is the part I need you to take carefully. She began turning pages. She kept turning them. She turned them through 4 decades of filings and yearly statements, and Roland's name did not rise up off any of them, and she turned them until she reached the very back, to the deed with the dead man's date, and she laid one finger flat on it. This is the first time the name Roland Vaughan appears anywhere in the recorded ownership of this company. Once, on the forgery, 41 years of pages, and he is on exactly one of them, and it is the fake.
I had spent my whole life calling that man my uncle. The family had said it so long and so easily that it hardened into a fact nobody checked. Roland the uncle, Roland the second in command, Roland who'd earned his chair. Sitting at that table with the seal still fresh on the paper, I finally set the word down and looked underneath it. Roland had come into the Vaughns sideways, through a door my grandfather's second marriage opened, and never once through blood. My grandfather married a second time, late, when my father was already a grown man, and the woman he married brought a grown son of her own, and that son was Roland. No Vaughan blood, not a drop of it. My father, Tom, was the only child my grandfather ever made, and my father's name stood on the first page the morning the doors opened, next to his. My father's name on that first page did something to me I hadn't braced for. Tom Vaughan, in my grandfather's own hand, 41 years back, the morning the doors opened. My father would have been younger then than I am now, a young man standing in an empty building that smelled of fresh paint and diesel, signing his name beside his father's on the thing the two of them were about to build with their hands. He didn't live to see me grown. He is a photograph on a hallway wall, a headstone I visit, a handful of stories other people hand me secondhand, and for most of my life the family let me believe his line had cashed out years ago, that whatever the Vaughns were to Tom ended the day Tom did. The certified chain said otherwise in a stranger's ink, page after sealed page. His line never cashed out. It ran unbroken from the morning the doors opened straight down into a trust that carried a 9-year-old's name, and the 9-year-old was me, and I had been the controlling owner of my grandfather's company for 26 years, every single day that Roland sat at the head of its table as though he had built the place with his own 2 hands. I remembered a thing my grandfather said to me once, in that same office back when I was small enough to be underfoot there, before I could spell half of what sat on his desk. I'd asked him plainly, the way boys do, whether Roland was my uncle for real. He didn't dress it up for me.
Roland's not blood, Danny. He came in grown when I married again, his own shoes already on his feet. Your father built this dock with me before Roland ever stood on it. He's your uncle because I say the word over him, not because there's a line of it written down anywhere. You remember your father when you're grown, Danny. Roland you can take or leave.
I had heard that as a boy and filed it under an old man being particular. I heard it now, 20-some years later, as the truth the certified chain had just stamped and sealed. For 3 years I had carried Roland's story as a theft. Roland took too much. Roland took what wasn't his share. Reyes said it in the present because it was still true in the present, sitting right there in her office with the seal not yet cool.
He isn't a man who lost his share, Danny. There was never a share of his to lose. In plain English, the only thing standing between Roland and a stranger who walked in off the street this morning is one sheet of paper he drew himself. He didn't take a company back. He walked into a family that let him borrow the word uncle, and when the only man who could contradict him was dead, he forged himself a bridge onto a bloodline he was never once standing on.
I sat with that a while in her office. 3 years I had watched Roland run my grandfather's company like a man born to the chair, signing the front of the building's paper, drawing the pay of a man who owned the place, handing out the seats around the founder's table as though they were his to hand. And underneath the whole weight of it there had only ever been the single sheet he'd inked one evening in an empty room. Not a share he bought, not a stake anybody gave him, not one drop of the blood he traded on. Now I was holding the state's own sealed word that the sheet was a fake and that there had been nothing underneath it to begin with. The man who had folded a stranger's coat over both my arms and told 200 people I was not one of them was the only person in that whole building who never had been. I thought, driving home with a sealed envelope on the seat, that this was the sharpest thing I would learn all week. Then Roland's daughter called my phone, and she was crying, and it took me the length of the call to understand she was not crying for her father. Paige and I had grown up at opposite ends of the same last name. She grew up inside it, walked through the offices with her hand held, groomed, called the next chapter before she was out of school. I grew up out on the dock with a rag and a hose. We were not close, and we were not enemies. We were two people who'd been handed very different scripts about the same family and told not to compare notes. So when she asked to meet me somewhere none of Roland's people would be, I picked a diner out by the highway and got there first. She came in still in her work clothes and sat down like she wasn't sure the chair would hold her. She had a stiff shopping bag on her lap, and she kept both hands on it and would not set it on the table.
I have to say it fast or I'm going to lose the nerve and go home.
Then say it fast.
They told me I was the future my whole life, every dinner. Paige runs it after your father. Paige is the next generation. Paige is the safe pair of hands. She laughed, and it came out crooked and wrong. Last week he put papers in front of me at that desk, the sale, the buyer, the price, the closing. And my name is on them, Danny, not down at the bottom where a seller signs, up at the front, as the family. As the heir handing the company over so the whole thing reads clean to the people buying it. He had my name going on the sale, not his.
Why not his?
Because if it ever comes apart, and something in me has always known it would come apart, the name printed on the front is the name they come asking questions of first. He wasn't crowning me. He was standing me in the doorway so that when the knock came, I'd be the one who opened it. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a second. He picked me to be the thing they'd reach for before they ever reached for him.
I had spent years half resenting Paige, without ever once knowing her, because she was the one they'd chosen, and I was the one they'd sent out to the dock, and it had been easy to resent her for the light they kept me out of. Across that booth I understood I'd had it backwards the whole time. She hadn't been chosen the way I'd always pictured it. She had been positioned. My grandfather had steered me toward his floor because he was proud of the floor and wanted his name safe in a pair of hands that knew the work of it. Roland had steered his daughter toward a signature line because he needed a face on the sale that a buyer would trust, and a name on the paperwork that was not his own for the day the accounting came due. One of us had been raised toward a thing, the other had been aimed at one. She told me more than she'd ever let herself understand at the time she saw it. The desk, the blank forms he kept in the drawer. She told me she had walked into my grandfather's office one evening that first summer and found her father hunched at the desk with a cover sheet and a fresh page, and that he had covered the page with his forearm the way a man covers a hand of cards, and told her, without looking up, to close the door. She was 27 years old.
I closed the door. I told myself he was doing estate paperwork because that's what you tell yourself when the man at the desk is your father and he's the one who signs the check that pays your rent. I've told myself a version of that for 3 years. I'm done telling it.
Before she got to the bag, she told me what he'd said the week before, at that same desk, when she'd finally asked him straight out why her name went on the front of the sale and his stayed off it.
Yours reads better, sweetheart. Buyers want to see a family handing it down. They pay more for a clean story than they'd ever pay for mine.
Then Paige set the shopping bag on the table and slid it across to me with 2 fingers. The way you push something you don't want to be caught holding. Inside, it was the brass nameplate off my grandfather's office door. Walter Vaughn, founder. The one Roland had pried loose that spring with a screwdriver and dropped into a box of things bound for the dumpster. Paige had taken it out of that box. She had kept it ever since in a drawer under her sweaters, she said, and she didn't fully know why until this week.
He was going to have it melted down. He said the metal was worth more than the sentiment. I couldn't stand there and let him. It's yours. It was always going to your father's side, and you're what's left of that side standing up. She stood and gathered her coat and looked at me steadier than she had all night. I'm not doing this to come out clean, Danny. I know what I let myself not see. I'm doing it because he picked me to take the fall and he picked you to vanish, and I would rather hand you this than help him do either one to us.
I looked at my grandfather's name in the metal, and I thought about the raw holes Roland had screwed his own plate into, and I did not tell Paige that I had already filed. I did not tell her what was going to happen in a ballroom she was planning to wear a nice dress to. I closed my hand over it, and the metal was cold, and I asked her the only thing I needed from her. When does the sale close?
At the Gala. In front of all of them, right after his speech, because he thinks doing a thing in a room full of witnesses makes it too big to unwind. She was almost to the door, and he needs it done fast. The other things he was always bragging about, the ventures, the deals on the side, they went under, all of them. There are people he owes real money to. The sale isn't a next chapter, it's a fire exit. He borrowed against the company to keep himself standing, and now he's selling it out from under every one of us before the loans he took come due.
She left first and quick, as if another minute in that booth might give me the time to change my mind about her. I sat in the booth with it in my lap until my coffee went cold and the light outside went orange, and before she'd gone, she had given me one more thing, a name.
If you want somebody who watched the whole thing happen from the floor, find Cy, the old foreman. He's been there longer than any of us, and he's never said one word because he's got a mortgage and my father signs his check, but he'll talk to you. He's the one who taught you how to coil a hose when you were 7.
The shield was the piece I kept turning over the whole way out to the yard. She'd worked it out 1 week before it was set to happen. 1 week. If she'd stayed asleep another 7 days, she'd have signed her own name onto the crime that finished her family, and she'd have believed she was making her father proud while her hand was still moving. Cy was still on the dock at 61, because Cy was not the kind to leave a floor until the floor was finished with him. He had 4 arms like knotted rope and a habit of looking at the trailer instead of at you when he had a hard thing to say. I found him at the tail end of a shift, hosing down the back of a rig, and I did not lead with the deed or the chain or my grandfather. I led with the bonuses. He turned the water off at the wall. That told me most of it before he'd said a single word.
You want the year it started, or the year I figured out what it was? Those aren't the same year, and I've had a long time to be ashamed of the gap between them.
Start wherever it's true.
Freight has fat years and lean years. In the fat years, your grandfather split the extra with the floor. Christmas, a real check. Everybody's name typed on the list, top of the list to the bottom. First fat year after we buried him, the checks came thin. Second fat year, they didn't come at all. Roland stood up at the same lunch the old man used to give us and told us times were hard and the extra had to go back into the company to keep her healthy. He coiled the hose without hurry while he talked, tucking the loops. Times weren't hard, Danny. I counted the loads myself in my own head every quarter, the way you do when your gut won't sit quiet. The extra didn't go back into the company. It went somewhere. He took a little off the top of what was owed the floor every single year, and he was careful about it. Never so much at once that any one man would walk out over his own number.
I knew the exact lunch he meant. My grandfather used to give it in the yard at the end of every good year, tables dragged out into the open between the parked trailers, and he read the bonus list himself, out loud, name by name, top of the sheet to the bottom, because he said a man's extra ought to be put in his hand, where the men he sweated beside could hear it read. Roland kept the tables, he kept the lunch, he kept the reading out loud. He kept the whole outward shape of the thing my grandfather had made, and he hollowed the one part that mattered clean out of the middle of it. And he did the hollowing standing in my grandfather's yard, using my grandfather's word for it. Hard times. A word my grandfather had never once had to say to those men in 41 years. Why did nobody say it out loud?
Because he signs the checks. You say it out loud with no paper in your hand to back you. You're just a man calling the boss a thief. And come Monday, there's no shift for you, and no reference to go find another one. I've got a mortgage and 11 years left before a pension I can actually live on. Half these men have kids at home who eat every night, whether the boss is honest or not. So we counted it in our heads on payday, and we kept our mouths shut, and I have hated the taste of my own quiet for a long time. He set the coiled hose on its hook and finally turned and looked at me. You want to know the part that eats me worse than the money? I'll give it to you for free.
Give it to me.
Your grandfather told me more than once, standing right about where you are, that this company was Tom's and Tom's boys, and everybody else in the building was a guest at the table. He said it to me flat the same week he put that deed in the safe. I heard it with my own ears. And I remember you out here at 7 with a hose bigger than you were, because the old man wanted you to know his floor before you ever learned his office. He was proud of that. It wasn't a punishment, it was the whole point of you. Then Roland took the proudest thing the old man did and made it a joke at your expense in front of the family. And I stood on this dock and let him more times than the once. That one's mine to carry, and I'll carry it. But if you're finally moving on him, I'm not carrying it quiet anymore.
There were names behind Sighs, and he gave me some of them without my having to ask. A dispatcher who'd kept her own quiet tally on a legal pad in the glove box of her car, 2 drivers who'd quit over checks that shrank year on year and never once got told why, a mechanic who'd been on the floor since the 2nd year the doors were open and had watched the Christmas list get shorter every winter until the winter it simply stopped. None of them had the kind of proof a courtroom calls proof. What each of them had was the thing Cy had, a clear memory of the number they'd been promised and the smaller number that landed in their hands, and the year the gap between the two first opened, and the man who stood up at the lunch and named it Hard Times. Put one of them alone on a stand and he's a bitter man with a grudge. Put 9 of them up in a row, each one carrying the same 3 years and the same shrinking list. And it stops being 9 grudges and starts being one pattern, and a pattern laid out in a straight line is a thing a court knows exactly how to read. I did not give him a speech back. He had hauled enough weight up the years without me stacking more of my own on top of it. You counted those loads in your head for years, I said. Would you put the count on paper now, with your name signed under it, if a court came and asked you to?
Every quarter, every year. I remember all of it. And I never wrote it down because writing it down was going to cost me a job I couldn't afford to lose over a number. He wiped his hands down the front of his coveralls and stood a little straighter than he had all evening. Are you finally doing something with it, Danny? Or is this another Vaughn coming down to the dock to feel better and then drive off?
Tonight. He nodded once, the way a man nods when a thing he has waited years for finally has a date fixed to it, and he turned the water back on and went back to the trailer, because the shift wasn't finished, and Cy had never left a job half done for a conversation. I got in my truck. There were a few hours left before the doors of that ballroom opened. I could have let the whole thing happen in a courtroom on a gray weekday morning, the way these matters usually happen, 3 people present and a clerk who'd processed 100 just like it before lunch. Reyes would have preferred exactly that. Cleaner, she said, safer, no audience, no chance for a room to turn. But Roland had not done his work to me in a courtroom. He had done it in a room packed with the people whose good opinion he'd spent 30 years renting on my grandfather's name, under a banner with his own future printed across it in gold. So I decided the paper would answer him in the same kind of room the insult had been spoken in. Not for the show of it, because he had made 200 people watch, and I wanted the truth of it to stand up in front of the same 200. The petition was filed. The forgery referral sat on a prosecutor's desk under a date stamp older than the party Roland was about to throw for himself. The certified chain lay sealed in Reyes's office, saying in the state's own ink, across 41 years of pages, that Roland Vaughn had never once held a founding share of the place. Page's account was written down and signed with her own hand. Cy would put his count on paper, and there were men on that floor who would follow him onto it. Every true thing I needed was already true and already on the record, filed by a stranger with a badge and a woman with an oath, not by a bitter man rummaging in the dark. All that was left in the world was the room, and the man who was going to stand up in it that night and give away something that had never for one day belonged to him. I slid the certified register into my inside pocket, next to the nameplate Page had handed back, and I drove to the ballroom where Roland was going to give away a company that had never been his to give. He'd set aside a coat for me to carry. I let him keep thinking that. At 9:30, Roland stepped up under the banner that read, Next Chapter, lifted his glass to 200 people, and told them he was about to make history. He was good at the room. I will give him that. He had the band paused, and the lights pulled down, warm, and a slide behind him, with the Vaughn freight arrow pointed up and to the right. He waited for the last fork to settle against the last plate. Then he tapped the microphone twice with one knuckle, the way my grandfather used to, and he smiled like a man who had never once in his life screwed his name into somebody else's holes.
He said, a man opens out of doors in this town with one leased truck and a handshake. Some of you knew him. All of you owe him. And tonight, standing where he stood, I am going to do the bravest thing a steward can do. I am going to let this company grow past the family that started it.
The family that started it. He said it looking straight over my head, to the tables near the stage where the people who mattered to him sat with their napkins in their laps. I was near the back, close to the service door, where an hour before a man in a gray blazer had put a hand on my elbow and suggested I would be more comfortable. I was comfortable. My hand rested flat against my own chest over the inside pocket, where the certified register sat folded and dry against my ribs.
There is a buyer in this room, Roland went on, who sees exactly what I see. By Monday, Vaughan Freight is part of something national, and the man who used to wash the trucks out back, he found me at the wall and let the pause carry it. Well, he can keep the memories the rest of us are going to build.
The whole ballroom laughed. It was the same laugh as the coat, 3 tables wide and easy. I have thought about that laugh a great deal since. It is not cruelty, not from most of them. It is 200 people agreeing on who is safe to laugh at because the man with the microphone told them it was allowed. So I decided to stop allowing it. I set my glass on the tray of a passing waiter, and I walked up the center aisle toward the stage while he was still speaking. Not fast. A man crossing his own floor. Heads turned as I passed, the way heads turn at the sound of a chair scraping in a quiet church. A woman I had known my whole life, a cousin of Roland's wife, caught my sleeve as I went by her table and hissed at me to sit down before I embarrassed the family. I stopped for exactly 1 second. "You have the wrong family," I said, and kept walking. By the time I reached the head table, the one with the founder's chair, Roland had stopped mid-sentence, and the navy coat I had folded over that chair at 8:45 was still exactly where I had left it. I moved it. I laid it over the back of the next chair, gently, and I took 2 folded papers out of my jacket and I opened them flat on the white tablecloth under the lights, side by side, where the front tables could see. On the left, the one page his whole claim sits on. On the right, 41 years of the truth.
Danny, Roland said into the microphone, warm for the room. Danny, buddy, this is a party. Whatever this is, it can wait for a business day. Somebody get him a chair in the back.
The man in the gray blazer started toward me from the wall. I did not look at him. I looked at Roland. "You asked me a question earlier tonight," I said. "No, you did not ask it. I asked you one. And you smiled at me instead of answering, so I will ask it again where they can all hear it. What date do you think the paper on the left was signed?"
I am not doing this with you, Roland said. Not here, not tonight.
"It is dated in the spring," I said. "The share transfer, the one paper that turns one leased truck and a handshake into yours. It is dated 3 weeks after we buried the man whose name is on it. He was 3 weeks in the ground on the day your paper says he sat down and signed his company over to you." I put one finger on the page. "A dead man has a very steady hand, Roland. Steadier than he had the last year he was alive." The gray blazer stopped. He had gotten close enough to take my arm, and then he heard the word buried and the word dead, and he did the arithmetic every person in that ballroom was doing, and he decided a coat check was above his pay grade tonight. He stepped back to the wall and stayed there.
That is an ugly thing to say at a memorial for a great man, Roland said, and he was still smiling, but the smile had gone flat and wide, held on only by the corners. Walter signed that transfer in front of me. I was there. You were washing something.
"He signed it 3 weeks after his own funeral," I said. "In front of you. Only ever you. That is the entire story of your 3 years, and you just told the front half of it into a microphone." A man at the second table set down his glass. A woman beside him leaned to hear better. That was the sound the room made now, glass after glass going down onto linen, 200 people quietly deciding they would rather hear this than a toast.
You have always been jealous, Roland said, and now he came off the little riser, down onto the floor where I stood. Because a man does not fight for a company from behind a podium, he fights for it standing on its ground. You have always believed that because Walter let you sweep his shop, the shop was somehow owed to you. You are not family, Danny. You are the help he was too soft to let go. And you have gone digging in a dead man's papers and stitched yourself a fairy tale.
Then read the fairy tale with me, I said, out loud, in front of your buyer. I did not raise my voice. I have found that a man who is telling the truth does not have to. Diane Reyes was already moving up the aisle behind me, unhurried, in a dark suit, a slim folder against her hip, and 200 people watched a stranger walk into the middle of a family fight as if she had every right to be there, because she did.
"My name is Diane Reyes," she said, loud enough, flat enough. "I am counsel of record for the founding ownership of Vaughan Freight. I am going to read 3 documents into this room, and then a 4th man standing by that door is going to read a 5th. Mr. Vaughan, from here on you would be wise to say nothing at all."
Counsel for the founding ownership, Roland said, and he laughed. One note. There is no founding ownership but me. Tell her somebody. Tell her who runs this company.
"The first document," Reyes said, as if he had not made a sound, "is a certified copy of the original incorporation register of Vaughan Freight issued 9 days ago by the State Corporate Division, under seal, custodian certification attached." She laid the page beside mine and set 2 fingers on it. "It records the founders as of the morning the doors opened. Line 1, Walter Vaughan. Line 2, Thomas Vaughan, his son, founding partner." And beneath them, added years later in the same careful hand, a trust held for a minor child. Daniel Vaughan. The controlling line every day since. Every other name in the book is Walter's blood, who was there the first morning. Roland Vaughan does not appear on it. Not on line 4. Not on the last line. Not once in 41 years of amendments. He has drawn a salary from this company. He has never owned a bolt of it.
Roland's jaw did a small thing then, a tightening at the hinge that I would not have seen from the back of the room. I saw it because I was close now. I had spent a long time being kept at the backs of rooms. I was not at the back of this one.
"The second document," Reyes went on, "is the genuine's signature card Walton filed with the state in person, notarized decades ago. It is his hand, and there is no argument about it. The third document is an examiner's finding. An independent document examiner compared that card to the signature on the transfer. Mr. Vaughan filed with the state the summer after the funeral. Her finding, which I will read exactly, is that the 2 signatures were not produced by the same hand. On the transfer, the capital V separate stroke, Walter made that letter in one continuous stroke. Every time for 41 years, including on the register I have just laid on this table. The examiner's phrase is a competent imitation by a second person. That is her language, not mine."
Handwriting, Roland said. You are going to unmake all of it on a woman's opinion about a letter.
No, I said. We are unmaking it on a calendar. The handwriting is only how we know you meant to. A calendar does not have opinions, Roland. He was dead. He stayed dead, and 3 weeks later a signature showed up. Here is the part I did not plan, and would take back if I could, because for 1 second I felt something in that room I had no wish to feel. Roland looked down at the register. He looked at the trust line, the one held for a minor child, Daniel Vaughan, opened the year I turned 9, when he was already a grown man married into the family and I was a boy with a rag in my hand. And whatever he had been telling himself for 30 years, whatever he had built out of being the largest man at every table he sat at, I watched it walk up and meet the page. He had never read the register to the end. He had married into a family with a company in it, and he had decided that standing close enough to a thing for long enough makes it yours.
I kept this place breathing, he said. Lower now. Not for the room, for me. Do you have any idea? Your father's line was clever and useless. Walter was old and soft, and he was going to hand a freight company to a boy who liked the smell of engine soap. Somebody in this family had to be a grown man about it. I signed one piece of paper so that somebody could be the grown man.
You signed a dead man's name, I said, 3 weeks after we lowered him, so you could sell the grown man's company before the men you owe money to caught up with you. You have been underwater for years, Roland. You put a loan against this building without asking a single person whose name is actually on it. You shaved the crew's bonuses a little every year so the quarter would close clean, and you told them it was a hard year, every single year, and it was never a hard year. It was you. The sale is not the bravest thing a steward can do. It is a man running from his creditors out the front door of somebody else's house in a rented tuxedo to a band. That landed somewhere, true, because he stopped defending and started hating. And on a man's face, the two can look almost the same. But they are not. And behind him, at the table to the left, a young woman stood. Paige, his daughter. The successor he had groomed since she was old enough to read a balance sheet. She did not go to him. She came to me, and she stood at my shoulder facing the room, and she said one thing, clearly, so that nobody could pretend afterward they had not heard her say it.
My name was going on to the sale papers next week, Paige said, not his. He put me on the front of it so that if any of this ever came apart, he could say his own daughter signed, that it was the young generation's decision, not his. She looked at her father across the little distance. You were going to hand me the pen and stand behind me, so no, I read it too, and I am done being the thing you stand behind.
Twice my grandfather had offered Roland something honest. Reyes had found it in the old minute books, in Walter's blunt square hand, and had shown me the pages the week before. Twice, years apart, Walter had offered to write Roland onto the register for real, a small, clean, earned share, his own line under the family. Twice Roland had said in writing that a small share was an insult to a man of his standing in this town. He did not want a line on the page. He wanted the top of it. So when the one man who could have given him a real line died in the spring, Roland took a pen and gave himself the whole thing, and he chose that over the honest offer he had turned down to Walter's face, not once, but twice. There was a fourth man. He had come in earlier through the service door, the one they liked to send me out of, and he had stood along the back wall the whole while in the way that men in that particular jacket learn to stand, still and unbothered, part of the paint. He walked up the aisle now. He was not hurrying either. No one who is carrying the paper is ever in a hurry.
Roland Vaughn, the deputy said. I have an order for you, signed by a judge this afternoon. I am going to read it out loud so there is no confusion in the morning, and then I am going to put it in your hand, and you are served.
This is my event, Roland said. These are my guests. You cannot walk in here and...
By order of the civil court, the deputy read over him, unfolding the page. The share transfer deed recorded in the name of Walter Vaughn is declared void from the beginning, as though it had never been executed, upon a finding that it bears a signature affixed after the signatory's death. Effective this moment, Roland Vaughn is removed as an officer and as a director of Vaughn Freight, and is enjoined from entering its premises or transacting in its name. The corporate and holding accounts of Vaughn Freight are frozen tonight, pending a full accounting. All dividends distributed and all officer compensation paid to Roland Vaughn under the void deed are subject to disgorgement back to the company. He turned the page over. Further, the question of the signature is referred to the district attorney's forgery unit for review. That last part is not mine to carry out tonight. The rest of it already happened while I was reading it. You are out, sir.
He held the order out. For a moment, Roland did not take it. The way a man will refuse to take a thing because he believes not taking it keeps the thing from being real. The deputy simply held it there in the air. That is the whole quiet power of the paper. It can wait as long as it needs to. Roland took it. He still had the champagne flute in his other hand, from his own toast, and I heard the thin sound of the stem before I understood what it was. A small dry crack as his hand came down on the edge of the podium to steady himself. A hairline climbed the glass from base to bowl. He never noticed it. Everyone at the front table noticed it. He turned to the room then, the way he had turned to it all night, and reached for it with his voice.
This is a mistake, he said loud to the tables, to the people who had raised their glasses with him 20 minutes before. This is this is a family matter. It will be sorted out, everyone, please. Sit down, the evening is not.
He was still talking into a room that had stopped being his. Not one person sat back down. A microphone only works when the people in front of it have already agreed to listen, and they had already agreed the other way, quietly, somewhere between the salad course and now. I want to tell you the room gasped or shouted or turned on him. It did not. It did the quieter thing, the worst thing for a man like Roland. It went still, and then it began to rearrange itself, physically in small movements, the way a crowd shifts. When it has silently agreed, the center of the room has moved and would prefer not to be caught standing near the old one. Chairs turned a few degrees on the carpet. People who had laughed at the coat discovered urgent things on their phones. Two men from the buyer's table, the national men, the entire reason for the evening, stood up without a word between them and began very calmly to leave. The older of the two paused at the mouth of the aisle and looked back at the register on the table, as if he needed to be sure of what he had seen, and then he went. He had flown across the country to buy a freight company and had watched it stop being for sale somewhere between the salad and the speeches. There would be a deposit to fight over and lawyers to feed, and all of it would land on Roland, because Roland was the man who had shaken a hand across a table and sold a thing that turned out to belong to somebody else. I took out my phone. From the founder's chair at the head of the table, where a few weeks earlier Roland had made me stand in the doorway, holding his overcoat like a hired valet, I called the number Reyes had written on the inside flap of her folder, and a man answered on the second ring in a room somewhere much quieter than mine. "This is Daniel Vaughn," I said. "I am the controlling owner of record of Vaughn Freight, as of a court order served in this room about 2 minutes ago, which your counsel is welcome to drive over and read tonight. There is no company for sale. There was never a seller. Whatever you initialed with Roland, you initialed with a man who owned nothing but a salary. Get home safe." I ended the call before he could turn it into a negotiation. It was not going to be one. And that was the sale. 41 years, one leased truck and a handshake. The national future Roland had promised 200 people under a lit banner, undone by a single telephone call placed by the man he had sent to find the coat check. He was 6 feet from me. He heard every word of it, and I believe that was the moment, and not before, that he finally understood I had not come to his gala to embarrass him. Embarrassment would have been a mercy. I had come to take it back, and I had already taken it back days ago, at a counter in a state office, with a clerk and a rubber stamp. The papers had been filed since Tuesday. The deputy had been in the parking lot since 9. The whole evening had been Roland lifting a glass to a thing that was already gone from his hands, and I had let him do it in full because I wanted every word of his speech to be on the record before the record corrected him. The word void reaches further than one deed, and the front tables understood that before the band had finished not playing. If the transfer had never existed, then Roland had never been an owner, and everything he had signed as one stood on nothing beneath it. The loan he had put against the building, the letters of intent with the buyer, every dividend he had drawn out of an account that was never his to open. It all came loose at once, the way a bad knot does, not strand by strand, but all together the moment the right end is pulled. The signature itself is a separate question, in a separate building, for a room I will not be sitting in. The deputy had read the word referred, not the word charged, and I have been careful ever since to say it the same way he did. What happens to Roland for putting a dead man's name on a page is not mine to decide. What happened to the company was. Reyes gathered her 3 documents and left mine where it lay. She left the register face up on the tablecloth, in the light, where it had been the entire time, and she said only to me, quietly, "Pick that up whenever you like. It is not going anywhere. It never once did." Paige stayed at my shoulder. I understood a little of what it had cost her to stand up, because every person she had grown up learning to charm was in that room, and she had just handed them her own father, and she had done it not for me, a man she barely knew, but because he had penciled her name onto a sale so that his own would be easier to walk away from clean. She was not a decent person turning into a hero in front of us. She was a used person deciding, out loud, to stop being useful to him. I have come to trust that more than I trust the other kind.
He kept a second set of the bonus numbers, she said to me, low, while the room emptied around us. In a drawer at home, not at the office. The real ones. I have seen them. When the accountants come for the accounting, tell them to ask me. I will bring the drawer.
I will tell them, I said. Thank you. A director found me while the room was still thinning. A heavy man in a good suit who had sat at Roland's right hand for 10 years and had signed his own name under Roland's on every page put in front of him. He wanted me to know he had always had private doubts, that he had said as much to his wife more than once, that of course he stood ready to serve the true ownership. I let him get most of the way through it. "You will have a letter from Reyes on Monday," I said. "It will tell you whether you are staying. Do not spend tonight telling me what you always suspected. Spend next week telling the accountant what you always signed." He closed his mouth and remembered somewhere he needed to be. Paige did not stay long after that. She had a father to not go home with and a name to take back off a stack of papers, and both of those are things a person does alone. Before she went, she set something on the tablecloth beside the register, without a word. A heavy black fountain pen with her father's initials on the cap, the one he had been going to hand her the following week over the sale. She left it lying there and walked out through the front of the room, past all the tables, chin level, the way he had taught her to carry herself and put that walk to the one use he had never intended it for. No one dragged Roland out. That is not how any of it works, and it would have been so much less than what did happen. What happened was that he stood in the middle of a ballroom he had paid for, holding a cracked glass and a court order, while 200 people left it around him at the polite, unhurried speed of people who have suddenly remembered somewhere else to be. The band did not start again. The man in the gray blazer, who took his instruction from whoever the room agreed was in charge, drifted over and stood a respectful few feet from me, awaiting a use. I told him he could go home. He looked almost relieved to be given the instruction by someone. A knot of the crew had come. They were not on the guest list. Cy had brought them in through the loading dock and up the back stairs, 6 or 7 of them in their good shirts, the ones a man keeps for funerals. And they had been standing along the back wall through all of it, by the service door, in the very spot the gray blazer had first tried to park me. They had not laughed once, at the coat or at anything. They had never been the ones laughing. Cy found my eye down the whole length of the ballroom, and he did not smile. He only gave me one short nod, the nod a man gives another man who has finished a hard job and finished it correctly. Then he looked at the register on the table under the light, and he took his cap off, and he held it against his chest. A man of 61 took his cap off for a piece of paper because he knew whose name sat on line 1, and he knew it had gone back to being true. I did not yet know, standing there, what the shaved bonuses had cost each of them, one man at a time. Across the years, Roland called hard. I learned it later, at the dock, the way you learn everything true about the men you work beside. One of them had put off a knee that needed replacing. One had a son who had gone to the community college instead of the state school and had never once said a word about the difference. They had known Roland was skimming and had swallowed it, because a man with a family does not bet the job on a bonus he cannot prove was ever promised. I do not hold a second of that against them. I stood along the backs of enough rooms myself to know exactly why a man keeps his cap on and his mouth shut, and exactly what it takes before he will finally take the cap off. Roland came to find me one last time before he left. He came in close so it would stay between us, an old habit that death and a court order had not broken.
"You will run it into the dirt inside 2 years," he said. "You do not know the first thing about moving freight across this country. All you have ever known is a bucket and a rag."
"That may be true," I said, "but it will be mine to run into the dirt. It was never once yours to sell." I picked the register up off the tablecloth, folded it along its old crease, and put it back inside my jacket, over my ribs. "Go home, Roland. The accounts are frozen tonight, so do not sign anything for anyone, and do not promise anyone $1. You are going to need whatever is still yours for lawyers, and none of what is left can come to me or to the crew, so keep it. It is the last thing in this building you will get to keep." He left the way men like him always leave, back straight, chin level, telling the room with the set of his shoulders that going was his own idea. Nobody in that room was fooled. You cannot walk out of a company you never owned with any dignity, because there was no dignity in there to take out with you. There never had been. There had only been a nameplate over a set of holes cut for another man's name. The order did exactly what the order said. The accounts thawed a month later into the company's hands, under the court's eye, not mine, and the money went where a judge sent it and not where I would have sent it. which turned out to be the same place. The dividends Roland had drawn on a company he never owned came back onto the books. The officer pay he had taken for 3 years came back. And out of the first clean money the company held in its right name, before anything else at all, 2 bills got paid. The crew got their bonuses, the years of them, the money he had shaved off a little at a time and called a hard year, paid back in full, every year of it counted honestly, into the accounts of men who had stood along a back wall in their funeral shirts with their caps in their hands. And the second bill. My grandfather's burial account had sat unpaid since the spring we buried him, because Roland kept saying the estate was tied up and the money would come. The man who opened a freight company with 1 leased truck and a handshake had lain in the ground the better part of 3 years with the bill still owing on the box he was buried in. I paid it out of that first honest money in full the week the accounts came back. I did not announce it to anyone. I am telling you, none of it came to me. I know what these stories usually promise the man at the end of them. I did not get rich the night I got the company back. I got a freight company that owes a bank money, because a man had leveraged the building, and a crew that trusts me because I paid them what they were already owed, and a set of books I will spend the next 10 years turning honest 1 quarter at a time. That was the entire prize. It was more than enough. On a Monday, I went back to the office, the real one, out on the yard, above the loading dock. The door still wore the wrong nameplate, the one that said Roland Vaughn, screwed into holes that had been drilled for a longer name. Page had handed me the old one in a parking garage 2 nights before the gala, the one Roland had pried off that spring and thrown in a drawer, the one that reads Walter Vaughn, founder. I took a screwdriver off the shop wall. I backed his plate out and set it face down in the drawer where his own had once kept my grandfather's hidden. Then I put my grandfather's back into the holes it was cut for, and the screws found their old threads and turned like they were glad of the work. The boy who was once only ever allowed to shine it was the one who hung it back on the door. I left the door open a hand's width. My grandfather always kept it open a crack when he was in, so the floor would know he was there and could come to him with a problem.
"Leave it open when you are in the room," he told me once, a boy following him down a row of trucks. "A shut door on this floor means a man is hiding a number he does not want found. I have got no numbers to hide from my own people. Neither will you."
So I left it open, and I did not close it behind me, because there was nothing in that office anymore that needed guarding. The thing that had been worth guarding had ridden in my inside pocket all night, and before that in a drawer at my house, and before that it had been pressed into my 2 hands by an old man who told me to keep it safe and knew to the letter what he was handing me. Then I went down the back stairs to the loading dock, where Cy had a rig pulled up with the winter road salt still crusted white along the panels, and a bucket and 2 sponges, because it was a Friday and one of the trucks was filthy, and I still like the way a clean truck looks pulling out of a yard into a cold morning. I took my jacket off and hung it on the mirror. I took the register out of the pocket first and set it on a dry crate, well back from the water, and I rolled my sleeves.
"You own the whole yard now," Cy said, holding out a sponge. "You do not have to do this part."
"I know," I said, and I took the sponge from his hand. "That is exactly why I get to." So we washed the truck. The 2 of us, and then 3 of the others who wandered down when they saw the bucket out in the cold, and none of us said much because there is not a great deal to say over a wet fender in January, and that is most of the reason I like it. The road salt came off the panels in long gray streaks and ran down the drain by the dock door. The register sat on its dry crate a few feet away and watched us, 41 years old, gone a little soft at the folds from a night riding in my jacket, worth more than the building it named, and no use at all against a dirty truck. Both of those things are true about it. I have made my peace with owning something that is worth everything on paper and nothing to a man with a sponge in his hand.
"Your grandfather washed trucks down here on Fridays, too," said. "Same corner as you. Worse technique than he ever owned up to."
"He taught me the technique," I said.
"I know. I watched him teach you," said. "You were maybe 7, up on a crate so you could reach the hood, and he kept telling you the corners come last, that any fool can do the flat middle of a thing." He wrung the sponge out into the bucket. You still leave the corners for last. Every truck all these years I have watched you do it, and I never once said anything. And I decided tonight was the night I would.
Say what? I said.
That he would have liked how you did the whole thing tonight, Cy said. The paper sitting on the crate, and the truck getting clean, and you not saying a word about either one. That is exactly how the old man would have done it. Now give me the dry sponge. This one is finished.
I gave him the dry sponge. I still go down to that dock on a Friday and wash a truck with Cy, and I leave my grandfather's door open a hand's width while I do it, and the water is always cold, and my hands are always the last part of me to warm back up. Roland calls now and then, from the number I never saved. I do not answer it. The door on that floor is open a crack, the founder's chair is not. Those are two different things, and I learned the difference between them from a man who was handed the honest one twice and forged the other one instead. He called me the help at his own party, in front of 200 people, and he screwed his own name into my grandfather's door, and he stood under a banner and tried to give away a company that was never once, on any page, in any single year, his to give. So let me ask you what I have wondered ever since. What would you have done if the man who told a whole room you did not belong at the table turned out to be the only person in it whose name had never been written on the paper at all? Until next time.